So we're going to talk about asset management plans, and I think you had a quiz last week about asset management plans that Dr. Henning got me to write, and we're going to address some of the issues around that quiz right at the end of this lecture. So I don't know if you've had a go at the quiz or not. And at one level, I made it as simple as I could, but at another level, our whole industry, in terms of people writing asset plans, that's what we fail at. We do all the technical analysis, and you do lots of great technical analysis and modelling and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, you have to tell a story about what is needed to be done. So you've got to come back up out of the technical detail and provide a story for management or governance decision makers or the community who's going to fund what's going on. So you've already seen this, and I think you're all in the room previously. The only thing I'd highlight off this one is I've done an awful lot of asset management plans. I started writing asset management plans in 1996, which is quite a long time ago. And we've done, as an industry, we're in about our 10th cycle in New Zealand. We do them every 3 years here. Now, the interesting thing about this sort of planning is it lines up with political cycles. So in America, where they have a 4-year cycle, they do their asset plans every 4 years because you need to be presenting investment decisions to new decision makers. So the UK, that has a 5-year political cycle, they do their plans every 5 years. Places like China that have a 5-year People's Congress and a big decision making, they would plan on a 5-year cycle and longer. But a few years ago I was in America and they'd been reading our manuals and they said, why do you do 3 years? It seems so short. And they hadn't made the connection that we have a 3-year political cycle. And we said, here in New Zealand, we've got a 3-year political cycle and we don't trust our politicians. They said, we get that. Oh, good, now it makes sense. So the asset plan updating cycle is based on political cycles. That's the thing. In the Pacific and in parts of Asia with the development banks, countries do 5-year strategic plans and update those. So if you were doing asset plans, you would do them on a 5-year cycle into that sort of country. In the Philippines, the presidential cycle is 6 years. So you might go, we will update our plans either every half cycle, 3 years, or definitely every 6 years when a new president comes in. Because the new president is going to look at all the requirements for expenditure, talk to the Senate in the Philippines, approve the next cycle of funding. One of the things about the Philippines, and we didn't talk about this in growth, but Dr. Henning and myself worked up there, the population projections for the Philippines for another 30 million people by 2050. So it's about 1.1 million extra people a year. That's not immigration, that's babies and people living longer. And so one of the things you can say for sure in the Philippines is that they're going to continue to invest in infrastructure with another 30 million people and by 2050. And there's really nothing that's going to change that unless everybody stopped having babies. It doesn't seem likely. So, and you notice it in the Philippine cities, there's just children everywhere. You come back here and you go, there's not that many children here. And in countries where there's very high growth rates like that, you just see children everywhere, and so lots more emphasis on education. But you need more schools, or you need to double up on the schools. You need more roads, houses, all of those sorts of things. So that's sort of going back to the previous lecture. Since when we started doing this stuff in 1996, there was only one real manual available. And since then, there's been a heap of guidelines and manuals being produced. There's the International Infrastructure Management Manual. The 2015 version of it was printed, and the 2020 version is online. In 2014, ISO 55000 series, so there's 55,000, 55,001, 55,002, and they are the international standard for asset management. So they were produced, and they're the standard, if you like, and the International Infrastructure Management Manual is an implementation toolkit. Don't mix them up. And when I was involved in some of the sections, writing some of the sections in 2015, and in the 2015 update, we cross-referenced it all against the ISO, so that the two are complementary. There's individual guides for individual industries, both here and in New Zealand, in Australia, but also right around the world. When Dr. Henning and I were doing the work in Saudi Arabia, the Saudis looked to America, so their transportation, they look to the American AASHTO standards, and there's an AASHTO standard for infrastructure management. We also looked at, because they were getting quite a lot of influence from UK consultants, there's the Institute of Asset Management in the UK, so we looked up and pulled that into that work as well as the ISO, as well as the International Infrastructure Management Manual. So we did a merge on all four sets. So what I'm trying to say is different areas of the world and different countries have their own guides or practice notes, more and more based on the ISO. And then you can have individual templates for industries. And in New Zealand we have the TEC's, the Tertiary Education Commission, so there's one for universities and schools. The CAM is the New Zealand Treasury Capital Asset Management Guide. And so, again, I know in the Philippines, because we helped them write it, they now have an asset management policy, and they have a standard template for asset management plans that, I've got to remember the name of it, hundreds of acronyms, but they have a bureau of they approve all the money. So they have the Treasury that gets all the money, and this bureau that signs off on all the money. And that bureau is the one that holds the template in the Philippines. Back in 2000, so I have this website called inframanage.com that has lots and lots of resources up there for free. When I was younger than most of you, New Zealand was quite poor. We were 25 New Zealand dollars or cents to the UK pound. So if we wanted to buy a manual from the UK, we multiplied the New Zealand dollar by 4 to buy the manual. So there was one manual I wanted, particularly at the time, that was nearly £1,000. I went to my boss and he says, "That's $4,000. No." So I got very, very, very good at scrounging any piece of, hunting it out. There was no internet. There was libraries. There was somebody would have bought it, and you'd turn up in their office who you knew and say, "Hey, can I just photocopy those 2 pages because I really want that graph to work out how I'm going to do stuff." So in my very young days of an engineer, I got very, very good at finding information, anything I could to help me do my job better. Now, people in the Pacific and people in, all across the world who can't go to top-notch, really good universities like this, or they can't go to international conferences, they still want to do their job really well. And so my thought with this inframanage.com is just to provide resources that they can find. This lecture here, these lectures will end up on that in time. But there's lots and lots of other resources, because often you can teach yourself things, even doesn't matter where you are, as long as you can get onto the internet. And we have access from all over the world. People come in and look at it. So, back in May 2021, for a lecture here, and I also do some lecturing for the BEng Tech at Otago Polytech for asset management. People were going, "Ross, what's in an asset plan?" I thought, well, it's... if I was to take you through an asset management plan and everything in it, it would take a couple of hours. And so what I did was I found this plan by Christchurch City Council Community Facilities. I got their approval to do an online lecture using as an example. It's actually quite a good plan. And I turned each page And whilst we had the page up on the screen, said, hey, this is why they've got this stuff here. And so that's really me just explaining what's in each section of an asset plan, why it's there, what's good, what's missing. And it was a pretty good plan. So that's a resource that's available to you if you want to dig into this topic a bit more, free, and you can just dive in and have a look at it. You will probably get sick of me talking, but that's... But there's a lot of information in there that I can't give in a lecture like this. So, but also encourage you to have a look around inframanage.com if you want to see more. If you have colleagues in other places, encourage them as well. It's a free resource. This diagram is actually Dr. Henning's, so with a little bit of help from me. And the thing about infrastructure asset management, so my background is civil engineering, and where it started was an engineering discipline. And what we realised really, really quickly is it's much broader than just engineering. So it involves planning and risk management, it involves sociology, IT systems design, analysis of data, legal and contract management, financial management. I know far more about accounting than I ever wanted to in my entire life. I started my career building things. Accountants were people that counted the money and gave you money to build things. I now know, as a result of 30 years of work in this area, I know a lot about accounting. I have a huge respect for accountants now, even though I do tease my business accountant somewhat on occasion. And obviously civil engineering and also climate change and adaptation thinking. So it's an amalgam of a whole heap of disciplines, and each of those disciplines brings certain things to the table in terms of the thinking and the planning and the professional discipline. The reason I've got this slide in here is when you're thinking about asset plans, they're a multidisciplinary joining up of information. And if you sit down and try and do it all on your own, you will miss stuff, simply because you don't have the training and experience in that particular area. And the process forces you to talk to other disciplines and understand what their drivers are. And very, very good asset plans bring together and synergise the information from a wide range of disciplines. So something to bear in mind. With asset management planning, it occurs at 3 levels. So the strategic level is the 10 to 50 year stuff, and that demand information we were talking about in the previous lecture is part of the strategic, because that impacts. Water resource availability impacts. If you have no water, you will either abandon a place or you're going to go looking for water and paying a fortune for it. And in the case of Auckland, the Waikato pipeline was an example of that. Auckland ran out of available water resource locally and had to poke a pipeline through the Waikato at quite high expense. The strategic stuff can be long-term government policy and direction. Anything that's sort of 10 years plus and is setting the big picture. The tactical information is where the asset management plans sit. It's around your renewal and rehabilitation planning. It's around your capital planning based on the strategic picture. And that's sort of what we would call the tactical area of asset management planning. And then your operational stuff. So tactical planning is 1 to 10 years, if you like, as a time frame, maybe stretching out to 15 years. And then you've got the operational part of it, and that's the 1 year, 2 year. That's maintaining, operating, building stuff, physical works. And where we have problems is there's a lot of friction between each of the levels and the information flows. And here in New Zealand, I don't know so much about the rest of the world, but we have this real problem where people produce a strategic plan and jump straight to operational and miss the tactical planning in the middle. And so that's something just to keep in mind, that there are 3 levels, and that if you're going to find disruptions, they'll be between the levels. A really simple example is I sometimes get to go and audit service delivery contracts, so operational contracts, often when the wheels are falling off. And I've got sufficient experience that I know where wheels fall off contracts, and I can come in and ask questions and things like that. And often you'll find at this tactical level, there's been a set of levels of the service defined in the asset plan and agreed by the governing body, and everybody's happy. And you go and read the contract, and those are not the same service levels in the contract. The service levels are the ones that were there 10 years ago, because the person that was rewriting the contract wasn't interested in the service levels, they were interested in the rates and the schedule. And so what set of service levels in that case do you think the contractor is going to deliver? He's going to deliver what's in the contract, you hope, maybe less. He's certainly not going to deliver. If the contract says deliver this, and up here it says deliver something different, what gets delivered is what's contracted. And so you get those sorts of disconnects going on because the documents are produced by different parts of organisations. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about friction between the levels. Something to be aware of. Again, this is one of Dr. Henning's slides, and we produced this one for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia Ministry of Transport. And it was really around road asset management, these four key drivers. First of all, you need to preserve what you've got. Because good roads, if you maintain roads in a good condition, that costs a lot less than letting them fail and then having to rebuild them. You have to think of in terms of the whole system, not individual projects, and it's the same in the asset planning. By looking at the whole system, you're trying to minimise your life cycle cost, so that's the optimisation. In Saudi Arabia, they produce a lot of fuel and bitumen and stuff like that, so the materials are dirt cheap, and they spend a fortune on their roads. But even a country as rich as that, they still have to think about what's the whole of life cost. And they were starting to do that. And then ultimately, what you're doing needs to be sustainable. And sustainability is not just what we think of in terms of circular economy sustainability, it's around resource sustainability. Have I got enough people? Are they sufficiently qualified? Are they trained well enough? Do I have enough money? Do I understand what I'm trying to do to keep the system? And how does that meet my national objectives? So sustainability is the circular economy is part of sustainability, but sustainability is around delivering the services over quite a long period of time. This diagram is an adaptation of one from Appendix B of ISO 55001, I think. And it basically shows you where asset management plans fit within the wider asset management system. And when they're talking system, they're not talking IT, they're talking the system of delivering asset management. So up at the top there, you have your organisational plans and objectives, and that can be for a whole country or for an individual organisation. You have this layer of an asset management policy and a strategic asset management plan. Those strategic asset management plans sometimes have different names. So in the Philippines, they called it the National Asset Management Plan, the NAMP, rather than a SAMP, S-A-M-P. So they're always around. They're the first thing that you do before you do the detail. But they set the big picture thing for the whole of government often, or the whole of organisation. Then you come down to your individual asset management plans. Policy is really important. Here in New Zealand, we're not so flash on policy. When we first started asset plans in 1996, we had no policies. Policies came into being for asset planning around about 2006 and then got incorporated into the manuals. A policy with no action isn't much use, but actions with no policy also can be not so much use because they can be quite misguided. So you get asset plans, which is what we're talking about in this lecture. They're also, you have this broader system of asset management, how you support that, information systems, information about your implementation of your plans, thinking about your whole of portfolio, and then down at the bottom, this loop of have we achieved stuff, are we delivering, how does that feed back into our planning? Okay, so it's a continuous loop, it never stays still. When I first, the first asset plans I did in 1996, I said, oh look, the government's asking us to do this, I'll write these and then I'll get back to real engineering was what I was thinking, you know. So real engineering being building roads and bridges and water supply treatment plants and things like that. Never got back there. But I enjoy this, obviously. So, this is the structure of the International Infrastructure Management Manual. And so there's three main, the section 2, 3 and 4. The section 2 is understanding requirements, and that's the levels of service, the demand and the collating asset information. I tend to bring risk over onto this, as we saw in that diagram in the last lecture when we look at again. This is your life cycle decision making, your financial planning, capital investment, managing operations and maintenance, and then you've got what these call these enablers over here, which are asset management, leadership, planning. So this is your asset plans, management systems, IT tools, service delivery models, and audit improvement. So that's the three blocks. Tiens and I, when we were doing the work in Saudi Arabia, said, hey, we're really shy on safety and security here in New Zealand. We don't have a lot of safety and security issues, but we should at least plan for them. When you go work in America after 9/11, they put in a lot more safety and security around their assets, and obviously a lot of places in the world aren't as safe as New Zealand, so they have a lot more focus on that. We said we should add sustainability, split out legislation. A lot of, for certainly big public assets, are driven by legislation. Asset management system strategy, add over on this slide. The ISO 55000 structure, just to give you an overview of that, is around asset outcomes delivering business outcomes at the top there, and that's driven by your policy, your strategy, objectives and plans. And you're looking at performance, cost and risk in terms of service levels. Down into the orange there, people, processes and technologies being the enablers. As we discussed in the last lecture, we have some huge problems here in New Zealand coming up around availability of people and the experience of that. And then you've got your resources down at the bottom, your funding resources, your physical works, and in fact the assets themselves. So ISO 55000 is built around that sort of structure, which is a little bit different from the structure, the previous structure there. As I said, they're complementary. But that's still, I think the focus on outcomes is a very good focus in the ISO. Why are you doing things? To what end? To what purpose? What outcome are you trying to deliver? How do you organise to deliver that outcome? One of the things that I've found in doing this now for more than 20 years is that there's an iterative process. Every time you think you understand asset management planning and how assets are performing, you realise you don't. So the more you understand, like many things, the more you understand, the more you realise you don't understand. Particularly for buried assets, you never have enough information about them. So there's this is the inside of a lighthouse, I think. I just grabbed the picture off the internet. But there's this continual spiral of more information and more understanding. One of the tricks is knowing when to stop, because being a technical person, you always want to have more information, and sometimes you just don't have enough information, and the way you manage that is by analysing risk if you don't have enough information. I did this paper back in 2015, and it was an Australian conference, even though it was run in New Zealand, and I won Best Asset Management Paper. That's a bit like the Australians saying to New Zealand, well done, you beat us at cricket. So I was pretty happy about winning a Best Paper in an Australian conference. And I took some inspiration from Albert Einstein. And I love this quote. because as an engineer, it does your head in. Because keep everything as simple as possible, but not simpler. What are your parameters? What is as simple as possible and what is not simpler? And the other thing about that, actually applying that, is you have to understand the subject to do that. Any fool can make things more complicated. It takes genius to make things simpler. And one of the real challenges in asset management planning is to simplify things and to get clarity about what you're trying to deliver and provide, coming back to your quiz, provide the right story to the people that are making decisions about the funding and resources. It's a good principle to apply to everything you do because it's hard. Simple is hard. People that crack that do extremely well. These things, and Apple in particular, made interface and communications and taking photos very simple. But there's levels and layers of complexity below that simplicity. But they sell 100 million of these a year at $1,000 each and make sackloads of money every year by simplifying. And if you're old enough to remember the old Nokia phones or the Blackberries, where you had hundreds of little buttons, simplify. So in the work that we do as asset managers or engineers, if you can take the problem and simplify it and communicate that clearly, that is a really, really incredibly strong thing to do, and it speaks of expertise. You think about E equals mc squared, the famous equation. Everybody can read that and think they understand it. Most people have no idea what that equation means. But it was simple enough that you go, oh yeah, I sort of get that. But the complexity sitting behind that E equals mc squared is sort of that's where Einstein really shone. So this is coming back to this diagram that this was the paper I won the award for. This was me trying to simplify 20 or 30 manuals down to one thing. Sitting underneath it is the base asset information. On the left-hand side are the things you need to understand to undertake the life cycle management. And on the right-hand side are the two drivers. When I was a young engineer, I was only interested in expenditure. Give me the money for operating and maintaining the network. Give me the money to replace stuff and fix it up. Give me the money to build new stuff. And depreciation came in later. I had no understanding that somebody has to pay for that. And there's lots of different ways, but sometimes things don't happen if there's no money to pay for it. So there has to be a discussion about that. When you dig into this diagram, what you find is that with levels of service, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more as we go forward, there'll be a gap. Levels of service might be specified by legislation or by law or by regulations, or they might have been set by the governing authority or the authority that's working. And when you actually measure what you're delivering or what you're required to deliver against what you're currently delivering, you almost always find a gap. Same with demand. So here in Auckland, as we discussed in the last lecture, the growth is faster than people are planning for. So there's a demand growth gap that everybody goes, why haven't you planned for it? Well, we were planning for 25,000 people a year for the whole country, and we're getting 25,000 of people or 30 or 40,000 people a year coming into Auckland. Doesn't match. So that's a gap. There's a risk gap. The more you dig into risk and understand it, the more you go, maybe we need to assign some more money or some more resources to managing that risk. There's climate adaptation gaps and sustainability gaps, and all of those feed into reconfiguring your assets or your networks, needing more, needing less, needing stuff in different places, changing the way you renew your profile if you understand the risk. A really good example of that is you don't let a major road or a major pipeline fail whilst you're busy fixing one in one single street. You know, at the end of the day, if one street's pipe fails, there's 10 people might be inconvenienced. If you let a major road or a major pipeline drop out, you might have 1 million people out of water, as an example. That then feeds over here to the financials. When you do an asset plan in any subject, you go through that process, levels of service demand risks, through the life cycle management, work out what you need to spend each year. If you're bringing online new roads or new treatment plants or new facilities or new pipelines, there's additional cost that goes on for operating and maintaining them. And you get over to a prediction of expenditure, and the time you do it for the first time, everybody's going to freak out about that point, because it'll probably be multiples higher than the existing budgets, because the existing budgets haven't done that analysis. And then that starts a conversation about, well, we can't afford that. That's too much. So you come back around here and you say, well, what did I get wrong over here? Do you want me to drop the service levels? No, we want more. Is the demand projection wrong? No, you've done that well. Are we prepared to take more risks? I don't understand risk, so yeah, probably. And what often happens, and I'm telling you this for a really good reason, is that you cut the budgets back, you make do, certainly in this country, because we don't have enough, we've got a big country and not many people. And what happens is the risk goes up of failure of service delivery, of failure of demand delivery, of capacity. And sometimes those things snowball. And the people who are making the decisions don't understand the trade-off with risk when they make the decisions. We're going to give you less money. Well, things will fail earlier. I'm only elected for 3 years, not my problem. And as engineers, we tend to take that risk on, and we're not very good at explaining it. And part of the quiz, and we'll talk about it later in the lecture, is that we need to be able to explain, if you cut the budget in half, stuff's going to break and people are going to be grumpy about it. And your current mayor in Auckland is doing that. And he has his objectives. He believes he was elected to do that. But there's this phrase, kicking the can down the road. So with infrastructure, there's never a free lunch. If you don't do stuff now, somebody pays for it later. Okay? Or you change the service levels and you're giving less service, or the demand all of a sudden is going to stop. But I think we've established in the previous lecture that's unlikely. Or the risks of failure go up, or other risks. And unfortunately, and certainly in New Zealand, but I think in most of Western society, we like to kick the can down the road and pretend that the problem doesn't exist when it does. So understanding that and explaining that in the asset management planning documents and other documents is a key part of this sort of work. So what are asset plans? Just a quick summary there. They're a structured plan to present the information about infrastructure assets. We've had multiple goes at multiple formats over 20 years, and different ideas have been tried, and where we are at the moment in terms of the layout is sort of it's landed where it's landed. I think it's a pretty good structure. Maybe some tweaks around the edges. We're now on our 10th cycle of plans in New Zealand. And it's become the national and international accepted way of presenting this sort of information. Particularly in transportation amps in New Zealand, we have introduced business cases as a structured part of the asset planning. So there's a strategic and an operational business case built into rating plans now. And I think Dr. Henning's going to talk about that when he comes back a little bit for the tutorial. But essentially it's a business case for long-term financial investment. And infrastructure is big dollars. As we looked at last lecture, it could be upwards of 5 to 10% of national GDP. If you think about most countries spend about 2% of GDP on their military. So it's double or 3 times military expenditure we spend on infrastructure. It's core to modern society. But the more dollars you're spending, the more opportunity you've got to waste dollars as well. So it's about not wasting. The thing, when I've gone to other countries, and even in the US we're particularly keen on, so I say, well, are we going to spend less? Are we going to save money? So no, you'll probably spend more, but you won't waste it. You won't spend it in the wrong place, at the wrong time, on the wrong things. And you'll manage your risks. But when we first started doing asset management planning 25, 30 years ago, we thought, oh yeah, we're going to save money. And what we found out was we weren't spending anywhere near enough to deliver the service that we were supposed to be delivering. So it's not a money saving in that less money, less rates, less taxes. It's in a don't waste money is what it's about. It helps drive longer term thinking and planning. And it makes sure that at the end the organisation is operating in a financially sustainable manner. In Australia, they have this thing called the Sustainability Index. So they have, and it's a financial, they have what does the AMP predict? Let's say the AMP predicts we need to spend $100 million a year. What is the organisation actually spending? Spending $50 million a year. They are at a 0.5 sustainability. So that's how they do the math on that. And that's quite useful for communicating to decision makers. You guys are spending half what you need to deliver what you've promised. Oh. So can we give you more money? No, we need more people, not more money. So both actually. But so it's about, this is a problem everywhere. It's not just a problem here. The Americans, if you read some of their stuff, they're miles behind. They've got bridges and roads that were built in the 1950s and 60s that are falling to bits. They haven't spent the money. They don't want to spend the money. They're dropping bridges into rivers every few years. And you go, how does that happen? And it's just around their system of government and how they raise taxes, basically. So it's an interesting thing. You know, if you've got a big river and you've got to go for hundreds of kilometres around to get back to where you are on the other side, and somebody puts a bridge in, you're very, very happy at that point to pay for that bridge, because now instead of wasting a day to go around to get over the river, you now do that in 10 minutes. But very, very soon you forget about that and you go, oh, I just go across the river in 10 minutes. And somebody comes along and says, oh, we need to spend $50 million to replace the bridge. You go, the bridge is there. I'm happy. I want to have a coffee, not pay for a bridge. I want to have a streaming service on my iPhone to watch my favourite videos, in my case on history. I don't want to pay for this bridge, it's already there. And that's the problem that we have. When there's no service, people are happy to pay for service. When the service is there, they're less happy to pay for it to continue to be there. So it's just a human psychology thing. Yeah. Bearing in mind those 3 levels of asset management plans are a tactical plan. You do have organisational or country strategic stuff below it, and you do have operational stuff above it and below it. So just where it fits in the cycle. Asset plans are an excellent framework to develop analysis and management strategies for infrastructure assets. We're fairly mature in terms of how we do that, but they always need improving because you never have enough information. You also have lots of assumptions in them, some of which change or play it in a different way, and they must be implemented. And I won't tell you how many asset plans that I've written, some of them, or I've been involved in writing, some of them when printed out this sort of size, and they're about as much use as a doorstop to keep the door open, because I'm the last person that read them. Okay? So like any document like that, if nobody does anything with it, why bother writing it in the first place? But when they are used, they're very powerful for organisations and whole of governments. But a lot of them become too technical and people can't get the information they need out of them, and they don't want to fund it. Anyway, they actually don't want to know what they say, so if you don't want to know what something says, you don't read it. So we'll come back to this diagram. What Dr. Henning asked me to do, and this is quite a complicated subject, so I'm going to talk about it, as opposed to I could spend a week trying to explain this to you and I'll still be going. So you're going to get this in 20 minutes or so. Keep this diagram in your head. We'll drop back to it a few times. What Dr. Henning asked me to explain to you is how do these interrelationships work and how do they inform each other? And at one level it's simple, and just below simple it's incredibly complex. So I'm going to try and explain a little bit of that to you, and I'll come back to the diagram. So we'll start with the asset description. So this stuff here, the inventory and the register. The first thing you need to do in an asset plan is what are you managing? What is the assets in the portfolio? And do you have an inventory or a register of them? Now that might sound really, really simple, but it's not, because we often have multiple organisations. And a really simple example is stormwater catch pits and the leads out to the pipe. Who owns those, you might ask? Now, in New Zealand, we've had a huge debate about that because the Transportation Agency, the central government agency, funds maintenance on the catch pits, depending on where they are. Sometimes funds the maintenance on the lead but won't fund the maintenance on the main pipe. So you end up with an integrated system that sits in two parts of the organisation in terms of inventories based on the funding. And you go, well, that's why? But those sorts of things. Sometimes with stormwater drains, they're privately owned. Sometimes they're owned by the public authority. Sorting that sort of stuff out. Where does the water pipe? Does it stop at the boundary? Is that owned by public? Who owns the stuff inside the boundary? On it goes. So even with roads, we have in New Zealand, not so much in cities, but out in the country areas, we have what are called paper roads. So the road was created, but there's no road there. Is that a road? On it goes. So the first part of asset management planning and asset plans is what am I managing? Who owns it? Where is it? Sometimes, particularly with buried assets, that can be quite a hard question to answer. One of the ones that I love when I'm reviewing transportation plans, they're focused on the road carriageway and bridges and culverts because that's the major stuff. And I'll go and I'll look and I go, have you guys got any retaining walls? Oh yeah, there's hundreds of them. Oh, okay. Whose are they? Oh, we think they're ours. Have you got any records of them? No. Okay. Are you maintaining them? Well, we have no records, so no. So what happens when there's a lot of rain and a retaining wall, big road retaining wall lets go and blocks the highway or damages a house? Whose responsibility is that? If we say that's ours, then it's our responsibility. If we say that's ours, then the responsibility is ours. Say, oh, I think they are yours. You built them to start with when you put the road in. Oh, okay. So what do we need to do? We need to get those into our inventory and we need to inspect them and find out what condition they're in. And we need to see if they're still doing the job. I don't know if you know about big retaining structures, but they have drains in behind them to make sure that you don't get water build up and pressure, because water's very powerful. You get a whole lot of water sitting behind a big wall, it'll push it over. How do you inspect a drainage system behind a big road retaining wall? Because nobody ever thought about that when they put it in. So now we're starting to go, there's a whole class of assets that some authorities in New Zealand have no records whatsoever on. But the liability associated with those assets could be huge, including dropping an entire road out. So when you're looking at an asset inventory, generally they're built, but the question now in New Zealand, but in some countries they're not so much, but the question you look for is what's missing. What do I know should be in that inventory and isn't? And why isn't it there? Is it because somebody forgot? Is it because they don't know? And then so it's getting completeness around the inventory, and then once you know what assets you're looking after for that authority, what's the condition like? Now, for buried assets, for wastewater and stormwater assets, you can pull a camera up. Not so easy for water assets to pull a camera up because you generally have water in the pipes. So how do you know what condition your water pipes are in? The other thing is, if you have to dig holes to take samples out to see what the condition is, that's really expensive. So you're never going to get a full picture, you're only going to get a very partial picture. When you come to big concrete assets and mechanical assets, you can use non-destructive testing methods or condition sampling methods. You can do thermal imaging of pumps and things. So big pumps you don't have to rip them to bits to find out what the condition is. Some years ago I was working for a smaller authority, and they had some students like you in for Christmas holidays. And they were doing condition rating on their pump stations. And I said, how are they going with that? And they said, no, they're doing a really good job. We've got all the condition ratings. And they had a 1 was really, really good condition, and a 5 was really, really poor condition. Okay, so they'd gone and rated all the cast iron pipe work, and some of it was 20, 30, 40 years old. So I knew it wasn't in particularly good condition. And they'd come back, students had come back, and it wasn't the students' fault because they hadn't been briefed properly. But they'd come back and they said, all that pipe works, it's perfect, it's like new. And I said, how did you decide that? And they said, it was all newly painted. So it looked really good from the outside. And if you know anything about cast iron pipe work, it doesn't fail from the outside. It tuberculates and pits on the inside, and you get growths and nodules and things like that. And you actually got no way of determining, walking into a pump station, how good that pipe work is, unless it's leaking or broken or whatever. So the poor students had been sent to do a job they couldn't actually do, but they'd come away thinking they'd done a really good job. So I said to the people that were managing the asset, I said, look, you guys, the only way you can reliably do this is either you're going to start dismantling it, and it's not worth it, because the minute you start dismantling stuff, you'll break it, or you just do an assessment based on age. So you say, look, if it's 30 years old, we'll say it's in condition 4. As in it's getting quite old and we might need to replace it. Generally with cast iron pipework, you replace it at the same time as you replace the pumps, which is about every 25 or 30 years. So it's knowing those sorts of things when you do the condition. It's not assuming just because you look at something on the surface and it looks pretty that it's in good condition, because that's not what condition's about. The other thing and the underlying thing is performance. Is the asset delivering the service that it was built to, or that I require it to do? And so that's all just part of describing your assets, because you can have a perfectly new asset in the wrong position delivering nothing. Its physical condition is good, but it doesn't do the job that you bought it for. So you need to think about those things as well. So that's just the first step. That, going back to that diagram, that's just that. And that's a continual cycle of updating that information when you build new things and when you take things out, when you do samples. You do your assessments based on risk. So the bigger consequence of failure, the more you should know about it, basically. Service levels. So there's a few things about service levels. One is, what am I currently delivering? Lots of places don't know that. Or lots of people, places or organisations think they're delivering a particular service level and are not. That example I had where the asset plan, I told you where the asset plan had one and the contract had a different one, they might have been delivering half of what the contract said. So what are you actually delivering? What are you currently delivering is a good question to answer when you're considering service levels. Most countries, the service levels you're required to deliver are set by law, or they are set by a regulation or by an industry standard. So you need to know what you're required to deliver by law or regulation or industry standard. And match that. Is there a gap between what that is and what you're currently delivering? Very funny story. I wasn't there at the time, but one of my colleagues and Dr. Henning were in Saudi Arabia, and the King and the Crown Prince have a road that goes from the airport to the palace, and it's like a bowling green. It's a perfect road. And for whatever reason, this particular night, they went off that road and onto another road, and there was a pothole. And the King looked at the Crown Prince and went, "Pothole, what's this about?" So the Crown Prince picked up his phone, called his cousin, the Minister of the Interior, and said, "Arrest the Minister of Transport and the contractor." So Tiens and Grant turned up at the Ministry of Transport the next day. The contractor and the minister are both in jail. Difference between a democracy and an absolute monarchy. And everybody in the Ministry of Transport was running around because in most parts of the world, everybody knows that the bad stuff flows downwards. So if your man's in prison, it's coming your way. And they said to me, "Oh, what do you think about that?" I said, "That's a service level. When you think about it, the level of service that we've just established is unacceptable for the King to go over a pothole." The really funny thing about it was, by about mid-morning, the Ministry of Transport had a thought about that, and they went, "That's a City of Riyadh road they were on." And the City of Riyadh had the same thought, and they went, "Those bastards at the Ministry of Transport are going to pin this on us, and we'll end up in prison." So by lunchtime, there were everybody had dropped everything, there were massive teams out from both the Ministry of Transport and the City of Riyadh looking for this pothole to establish where it was and whose it was, so that they could blame, not so that they could fix it, just so they could blame each other and get their guy out of prison and somebody else in prison. And I found that quite funny, because at the end of the day, that was a service level that nobody knew existed. Okay? So depending on the, shall we say, the governmental structure of the country, there might be undeclared service levels that you find out retrospectively that could be quite threatening to your career or parts of your body in Saudi Arabia. Anyway, I think it resolved itself, and the pothole got fixed, so that was important. Service levels never stay the same. They increase over time. So they very rarely decrease unless you're abandoning a city or a town or something like that. So the next thing you need to know about service levels is what is changing, and what is changing compared to what you're currently delivering. That will then tell you what your gaps are And then that will tell you what you need to invest. So coming back to here, I've got my service levels. There's usually a gap between what you're legislated or regulated to deliver and what you are delivering. And the service levels change with time. People have new ideas and things like that. So that translates across into life cycle management. I need to make sure I've got the assets and the maintenance and the operations to deliver the specified service levels, which will be different from what I'm currently delivering. Even if your organisation is perfect and they are actually delivering what they're required, you'd still need to measure that and demonstrate it. So infrastructure management, infrastructure takes quite a large proportion of city or government total country GDP. People are going to want to know, hey, I'm spending all this money, are you delivering what we asked you to deliver? So that's what you need to do. And often you will need to change, modify, adapt, or invest more to meet the new service levels. So that's why you do that set of analysis. And that will then translate over into your life cycle management program. With demand, so we've had a good talk about demand at the previous lecture. The questions you're asking yourself is what is changing? So some places will grow, other places will be declining. Worldwide, a couple of years ago, across the whole world, we moved to more than 50% of the world living in cities. Prior to that, and particularly in places like India and Africa, more people were living in the country, farming and things like that, than they were living in the cities. So one of the things that's happening across the world is that people are moving from the countryside to cities for a whole heap of reasons. That's something that's changing in terms of growth. So less people or static people living in the countryside, adopting different agricultural methods, maybe more irrigation needed, whatever, but more people living in cities. Climate change is going to change that as well. Where's decline in population happening? To use the American example, the American Midwest and industrial areas, people are moving to the coasts and down to Texas. So you have growth on the coast, decline in the centre, in the Midwest. Detroit, its population in the last 30 or 40 years has halved from its maximum. And they're now knocking out whole blocks of abandoned houses that at the moment homeless people live in. So that's a whole other different story. But the thing is, you can have decline. Northern Japan, there's villages where they've just said, hey, nobody lives here anymore. Everybody's moved to the cities. And I think they just sort of say, we'll turn off the power, and I don't think they bowl the houses out, but they're empty. Decline, as I said in the previous lecture, is much harder to manage than growth because less people to pay, less justification for the cost, and it never happens all in a nice row. Decline in a town or a city happens some over here, some over there, and you still have to maintain all the infrastructure in the meantime. Asset capacity is something you need to know about when you're managing demand. Now, interesting thing about asset capacity is there's an amazing amount of elasticity in asset capacity until there isn't, until it maxes out. And then you get massive congestion on roads or overflow and flooding and drainage or lack of water coming or lack of electricity interruptions and things like that. When my primary school years were up in Whangarei in the 1970s, and we used to get, so I can remember when I was 7, 8, 9 years old, they were still building all the hydro dams down in the South Island, and we would get a warning that said, in 2 days' time there's not going to be enough power because it wasn't getting past Auckland, and so you'd get these brownouts for power. And then when all the hydro dams finished coming on stream, that stopped, but we moved to the South Island about the same time. So that was a capacity issue. There wasn't not enough coming into the system, too much coming out. Northland's the top end of the system, and it's got to go through Auckland. So, by the way, Auckland at that stage had a population of about 600,000 people. So that gives you an idea of the growth since. So the thing is, you know when you run out of capacity because the problems become quite apparent, but you need to, as engineers and in planning, you need to stay ahead of that if you can. So once you've done that sort of analysis, you can go, well, what do I need to invest to meet the demand gaps, and what new assets? So there's two things. One is building a new asset isn't always the answer. There are non-asset solutions, demand modification, things like that. If we were to take the example of COVID in Auckland, there were no traffic capacity issues in Auckland during the COVID lockdown because there was no traffic, or very little. Central Manila was like that, went from being able to go 500 metres in half an hour to 500 metres in less than a minute. So you can modify demand. Cities like London, they've got demand pricing as you come into the centre city, the congestion pricing and things like that. So you can use pricing signals. Toll roads can be used pricing signals to moderate demand in transport anyway. So it doesn't always have to be assets. You can do demand modification strategies as well. But coming back to this, that demand will often, we need to invest new capital, particularly in high growth, plus demand modification. Okay, risk. This is something that continues to grow. What are your risks? Asset, business, natural hazard, climate change. We've got all of them here in New Zealand. One of the things that with risk management, I lecture on risk management, and I had imported a Lexus from Japan. It was a 4-litre V8, and I owned it for 2.5 weeks before my son wrote it off one Friday night. Now the good news was he was okay. His friend who was in the passenger seat, whose parents we knew, was also okay, and the lady he hit was also okay. So people were okay. Car was dead. And I have a picture of this broken car. And I said to my son, who's now a lawyer, at the time, I said, what happened? He said, I never saw the other car, Dad. And I said, they're generally the ones you'll hit. And risk management's like that. It's what you don't see that will hit you. The stuff you can see, you go, oh, I can see that, we'll avoid that, we'll do that, we'll manage that. What don't you see? It's a really hard question to answer because you can't see it. But when you think about risk management, it's what you haven't anticipated, what you haven't seen is the stuff that hits you. And it's a really hard discipline to get. It's hard to get your head around it because you can't see it. So what you do is you start dealing with scenarios, again, building scenarios. Then you need to step back and say, right, what am I missing? What haven't I seen? What haven't I considered? What's changing? Why haven't I seen this? Generally, if something happens that you haven't seen and it's quite major, you go, you know, I should have thought about that. The Havelock North water incident, where they had 5,000 people get sick. I did a risk assessment on that council about 2 years before that incident on their water supply. And they had chlorinators on every single pump, but they were there for emergency chlorination. And they had groundwater bores that everybody assured me the groundwater was 100% and they'd never had any problems, there was no disease in it. That was the assumption that was wrong and untrue. And I looked at it and I said, right, they've got clean water bores and they've got chlorination if they need it. And that was what we thought. Now the thing we missed was that once you've got disease in a water supply, it's too late to chlorinate. Okay? So that was the thing we didn't see in that particular incident. The assumption was that the bores were good, the water was good, one of them wasn't. The second assumption was, oh, we've got what we need to fix it if we had a problem. But the problem always is, if you get bad water into a water supply, by the time you know that people are getting sick, it's too late. And that happens over 3 or 4 hours. and you're not testing continuously, so you don't know. Well, you weren't at that stage. So that's a little really practical and water supply example of what we didn't see. We had everything we thought we needed to manage that, but what we didn't see was it's too late once you know people sick. So 4 people died, not directly but indirectly from that incident. Not New Zealand's finest hour in terms of managing civil infrastructure, and it's led to all sorts of major changes that are ongoing. So what's changing? One of the fundamental rules of water supply disasters around the world is change always precedes problems. Big heavy rain, change in land use, change in supply, whatever it is. So with risk management, what don't you see? What's changing? Because stuff's always changing. How are you managing or mitigating that risk? Some of them you can't. Like, we cannot manage this country, Japan, Philippines, we're all on major fault lines. You know, Manila has 2 big fault lines running through it and a volcano in the middle of the bay. I know about that volcano because I had to fly to Cebu to Korea to the US because it was exploding rather than going out of Manila. 3 years ago. Some of that stuff we can't control volcanoes and we can't control earthquakes, but we can manage the risk by building stuff to be resilient to that. How are you financing that risk? So this is insurance. Do you have enough? Never. You never have enough insurance for big risks. But how are you managing when you have a big natural event? Can you restore? How resilient are you? Have you taken care of that? What do you need to do? And what do you need to invest to deal with those risk gaps? So here's risk. There's always gaps, and particularly in New Zealand, that's the bit that our decision makers are blind to. So they make decisions not to finance things or not to invest in resilience, and then get really surprised when something happens. But this is coming back to that quiz, this is part of the storytelling. If we don't do this, we're going to have this level of problem. Okay. And how do you make your decisions about managing risk? So risk's a really funny thing because you can ignore it and ignore it and ignore it, and then it hits you. And at that point, everything changes. Sometimes you can never, ever make good what changed. So with my son, coming back to that story, he says, "Dad, I'm so sorry about your new car. Only V8 I've ever owned," which is probably a good thing given sustainability environment. But I said, "Look, I'm pleased you're okay. I'm pleased the other people are okay. You can always buy a new car, can't buy a new boy." So, well, probably could, but not that particular one. So, so the thing is that if that accident had been worse and somebody had been really badly injured or killed, you can't change that. That's gone. Same with the water supply one. You know, those people can't be brought back. Much as the people who were involved wanted that to happen or tried to make it good, it's too late. Today, this morning, there's been a fire in Wellington in a boarding house. There's 6 or 7 people dead. No sprinklers, the alarms didn't work, big fire overnight. They think it was deliberately lit, 6 or 7 people dead. Can't go, "Oh, I wish we'd had sprinklers in that boarding house and alarms that worked." It's too late. So there's a risk that somebody knew about and it ignored. And there's going to be all sorts of inquiries about that, no doubt. So, but you can't bring back the people who are dead in that situation. So in terms of public infrastructure, what decisions are you making about managing the risk? And if the risks are getting critical, who are you advising about that risk? And how are you doing that? How are you telling that story regarding that? So how does that all fit into life cycle management? So you've got to link your service levels, your demand and your risk changes and your gaps. That's then going to inform your current and future predictions around operations and maintenance, Generally, the higher the risk of failure and the higher consequence of failure, the more that you should be managing it. More preventative maintenance, more inspections for condition and things like that. What are your current and future predictions for renewals, rehabilitation, refurbishment? And again, the higher the higher the consequences of failure or risk of failure, maybe you're going to get in early and do that before it fails. What are your current and future predictions for new assets required based on your service level gap analysis, your demand gap analysis and your risk gap analysis? When do you need to build stuff? Why do you need to build it? And hopefully you're going to tell a story about why it should be funded. Sometimes you need to dispose of assets, so how are you going to do that? And sometimes those assets are materials that are dangerous. I went to a seminar some years ago, a guy that was disposing of a nuclear power plant in the UK. And it was quite a small site footprint, but my goodness, nuclear, and it's an old style nuclear power plant with all sorts of radioactive rubbish coming out of it and stuff like that. And they were deconstructing the whole site and leaving it good. What a process that was. Multiple years, fantastic project planning, all sorts of risk management, but that's just disposing something that was built in the 1960s, end of life, multiple billions of dollars to dispose of the thing. So, not that we have any nuclear power plants in New Zealand, but other countries do, and something like that, or a contaminated site, or in New Zealand probably landfills, the disposable is a cost, and it's a multi-year cost, and it needs to be managed carefully. How are you financing the entire asset portfolio life cycle? And that was coming back to the diagram again. That's over this side, and generally when you do all the analysis you find there's nowhere near enough money in the system to pay for everything. So then, can we do things differently? Can we manage the risks differently? Have we actually sorted out the service levels and the demand well? Is there stuff that we can defer? Is there stuff that we can bring forward that's actually going to mean that we spend less money in the long term? How do we and that's that whole optimisation. Now, Dr. Henning is a world expert on asset optimisation. Believe it or not, he is. So if you've ever got questions about that, he's the guy to talk to. He just eats that stuff for breakfast. So, but that's what it's about. It's about optimising the what you're doing and what you need to spend to get the optimal, not necessarily the least, but the optimal long-term investment profile to deliver the services that the society needs or wants. Okay. Really important. And you build very sophisticated models to do that. Keep in mind with models, you're only as good as your assumptions. So if your assumptions are wrong, your model will be wrong. Okay, how does that all fit together? And this comes back to the quiz that I sent the questions. What is the right debate? And if you remember what I put at the start of that quiz, the Auditor General of New Zealand, really wise guy at the time, looked at the asset management plans we produced around about 2006. He said, look, these are fantastic, marvellous technical detail, great analysis, can't work out the story you're telling. So as engineers, and this comes back to keep it as simple as possible but not simpler, we're really good at complicated, detailed analysis. This is what we do. It comes very naturally to us. This is why we're in this sort of profession. You have to take that analysis, bring it up to a level and explain it to people at a level that you can that they can grasp it on half a page. If you know about business, the elevator pitch, the business school stuff. If you're in an elevator with Richard Branson or with Bill Gates or somebody like that, and you've got a minute and a half to pitch your idea, what would you tell them? Now, there's been whole businesses launched on that sort of idea. I end up in an elevator with a famous person, I go bang, 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 and they say, that's great, here, take my business card, contact my people, we'll do the deal. So that's the idea of an elevator pitch. With asset management planning, And with this, we're asking for hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars of money. The hardest thing is to produce an elevator pitch. Business schools spend years teaching it, but you have to be able to do it. And it's those, come back, what are the three key issues? So you've got a 200-page document asset plan, done all the detailed analysis, worked out all the expenditure predictions, worked out where the gaps and the issues are in service levels and in risk and in demand. Come back to your decision makers and say, what are the three things I have to tell you in 3 short paragraphs? How do I condense 200 pages to half a page? And in a way that the person who's getting elected and has to go out for the money, the Len Brown, goes, yeah, I love it. Go do it. So he's not necessarily somebody that wants to hear the message, is what I'm trying to say. And so that's the key. That was why the quiz was there, to get you thinking about that. And what's happening over the 10 to 20 years. Now, to give you an example, and I'm actually keynoting a conference in Chicago in September, end of September, and this is what they want me to talk about. The town I live in, before I went consulting, we did this sort of analysis. And the wastewater rates in particular needed to double. So they went from $400 a year per property to $800 or $900 a year. And because we'd done the analysis and we could show very, very clearly what needed to be done, and it went out and everybody talked about it, and they went, yeah, we need to spend that extra money over the next 20 or 30 years to do this stuff to maintain the service. And when it went to the vote, and you know, sometimes when councils vote on things and people don't agree, there's flooded letters to the editor and the paper has big front pages and things like that. The job had been done so well that they just went, yep, whole town went, we understand that. You know, it's an extra $1 a day. We can all afford $1 a day to make sure that the wastewater system works. And so it is possible to present the stuff in such a way and to get a major lift or step change in the funding if you explain it well and if you follow these principles. If the town had turned around and said, no, we're not going to fund that, then the answer is, what are you going to do with the risks? Because this is going to fail in 5 years and this is going to fail in 10 years. And you're going to end up with fines of $100,000 a day because you're going to be tipping water into the beach, wastewater into the beach. And you go, oh, well, that's actually not that smart, is it? Oh, maybe we should fund it. So it wasn't just, this is what we need to do. We had also presented, this is what the consequences of not doing this are. And it actually was a very, in that case, a very clear answer, which was to double the revenue, double the financials, and then just get on and start delivering the projects, which is what they did over a 20-year period. And a town of 30,000 people in the last 20 years has spent $65 million or $70 million on its wastewater system, and nobody's blinked. Because this is the power of doing things a little bit at a time. And one of the examples I give in the States and here, if we've got a sports game and our team is not scoring for 2/3 of the game, and the other team's scoring every 5 minutes and they're miles ahead, at some stage, if you're passionate about that sport, you'll start yelling at the TV, or if you're in the crowd, come on, you guys, just do something, score some points, for good, you know. And it's the same in America. They don't like paying for infrastructure, but they understand that if you don't keep the scoreboard ticking over, you will lose. Doesn't matter what sport it is. In infrastructure management, we maintain this idea that we can spend nothing for 30 or 40 years, and then right at the end of the game, we can catch up all that change and everything will be good. And it's as much of a fallacy in asset management as it is in professional sport. Whereas the authorities that just keep doing stuff every year, they spend all that money over 20 or 30 or 40 years. They achieve a huge amount of stuff and it's of no pain to society. If you do nothing for 40 years and all of a sudden, hey, we need to spend $10 billion, everybody goes, well, we can't afford it. How are we going to build it? What are we going to do? Well, the world's ending. Okay? It's not the way to do infrastructure management. The way to do it is incrementally every year. Same as how you win a professional sports game. Keep the scoreboard ticking over, tick over, tick over, tick over, all very painless at the end of the day. So that's what this stuff's about. Trying to help our communities have the services that they want and are prepared to pay for, doing it in an optimised way, not creating huge spikes in expenditure, because guess what huge spikes in expenditure are? Really expensive. If I come and I say I need to spend $10 billion this year, somebody will do it for you. It's always somebody to take your money, but they'll go, oh, well, we've got to mobilise, we've got to do all this, and it'll be really expensive. If you do it little bits at a time, people will do it at a reasonable, fair, long-term cost. So the cost to society is a lot less. Which is another reason. So that's just a conclusion about asset plans. Delivering levels of service is the really fundamental thing, and sorting out risk is the other one. And you must implement for the AMPs to be useful. And again, encourage you to look at inframanage.com and any questions.
I'm just thinking, we sort of spend 30 years at the end of the 30-year period rather than a bit of time. What you end up doing is you can't actually control your expenditure. You're going to hemorrhage money because there's going to be a lot of things that are failing or near to failure that you didn't realise that were near to failure. Whereas if you've been doing things on a piecemeal basis, on a regular basis.
Yep, that's precisely the problem
those other problems that you wouldn't exactly know about.
Yeah, and that's the problem we've got in New Zealand at the moment. We haven't done enough for the last 30 years, and it's caught up with us.
Well, I've personally experienced that in my working life, and it's not a fun position to be in, I'll tell you.
No.
Because the only thing we're giving to your bosses is bad news, and they eventually get sick of you and they don't want to know you anymore.
That's the one, yeah.
And you're working probably 80 to 90 to 100-hour weeks to try and rectify things that have gone too far.
Yep. Yep, exactly. So good management means staying on top of those things. And as I said a lot earlier, if you leave stuff, you'll get away with it for a period, and then it bites you. It's like the car crash. It's bang, and all of a sudden everything starts failing, it starts cascading, your ability to manage it goes out the window, and it costs a fortune to get back to where you need to be. It's not smart. We can do much better than that. But
this is not a problem that's unique to infrastructure assets at all. It's to do with plant and machinery.
oh yeah, yep,
Cranes is a good example.
yep.
I've seen terrible situations with them.
Even a personal example, saving for your retirement. If you, for argument's sake, you saved $1,000 for 50 years, you would have a good amount of money at the end of it. If you do nothing for 50 years and then you go, I need to save $1 million in 1 year, how likely are you to succeed? Not very much, So it's that incremental gains over a long period of time. That's an encouragement to try and save some money for your retirement. But anyway, it's the same sort of example. You can make huge gains over time doing little amounts of things. If you leave it all to the end, then it's very expensive and very hard to achieve.
But the whole issue is that managers, CEOs are only short tenure positions.
Yep,
So,
as are politicians.
as are politicians, so they're only thinking
So
in their term.
yep, so that's what this is about. This is about presenting all of that information in a way that the community, the politicians, or the managers can have the right debate. If at the end of the day you present that information and they go, nah, we're not doing anything about it, at least you've done the best you can in your job. It will still come back, you know that for sure. All it does is defer the problem, but I don't think we do that very well, even that bit of it.
Well, what do you think of the clip-on lanes of the Harbour Bridge? Where do you think that one's going?
Well, they'll fall into the harbour at some stage, and then there'll be a very expensive piece of money. I mean, they're monitoring them every week at the moment, aren't they? So, yeah.
But, you know, I know metal fatigue, once it sets in, it's
Yeah.
to increase exponentially. They can't do anything more to it.
Yeah, we're going to spend a humongous amount of money to try and fix it. Probably should be spending that money now.
You know, I would at least be putting new clip-on lanes in to start off with,
Yeah,
getting it all ready. But it's going to end up in tragedy in 10 years, and there's going to be a big inquiry, and how could that happen?
yeah. Well, we know how it happens. I mean, we
Yeah, and everybody's going to be ducking for cover, I can guarantee it.
about a decade ago, one of the big bridges over the Mississippi dropped into the Mississippi. It was an interstate bridge. And they'd been inspecting it every week, and they were actually on the bridge doing repairs the day that it dropped in. And they had a concrete mixer and a whole heap of cement, but they hadn't closed the bridge, which is what they should have done. So the thing was absolutely at maximum static load. They put some more static load on it for the repairs, and then a really big truck went across it with live load, and the bridge went down into the river. 13 people dead, 250, 300 million US dollars to fix it, and the bridge was out for about 12 months. And they knew they had a problem. It was a 1960s steel bridge design with weak gusset plates. People got sick of bouncing over a steel bridge, so they'd put concrete on it, and then they'd put hot mix on it, and it was, all the maths had been done. In America, the roading authority presumably paid a huge amount of money in liability claims to the 13 people that died and their families, but they're still dead. And that's poor risk management at the end of the day. Having said that, I did it in a risk management seminar, and I said, if you were the project manager, and I told them the information that the project manager had on the day, would you have made any other decision? And everybody in the room, class like you, said, no, we probably would have done the same thing. Because the critical piece of maths hadn't been done, which was adding that static load. And if you're the project manager, say, go take a cement truck out there, take some materials, strap a boom arm onto the bridge, get in under, do these repairs, do this, you assume that somebody's done the math, because your job's just to deliver the project. And the problem was they hadn't done the math on the additional load. And so the guy who was managing the project, who was a professional engineer, I'm like, how's he going to feel that day? But what the point I was trying to make with risk failure is almost always you can trace it back to you making an assumption that's not valid. Or assuming that somebody's actually done enough work to check something before they tell you to do something. Often never happens. And so it was, what I was trying to teach was have your minds open to problems again, back to the car smash, what can't you see, and ask the questions before you do things like that. So when you've got a bridge that you know is on its absolutely last legs, that is overloaded already, that you're there to fix a known problem, and somebody says, oh no, you can't close it off. You say, well, hang on, we're going to add load and then we're going to have live load. So there was an overloaded truck on it bouncing across the bridge. On top of it, already overloaded, plus some load for the fix. Poor old bridge did its best, but at the end of the day, down into the river. But I looked at it and I said, if I'd been that project manager, would I have asked that question? The answer is probably not. I would assume that somebody had done that and they had done the checks. So that's just been a good, asking questions as an engineer. Has that been checked? No. Well, perhaps we should check it before we put any more load on that bridge. Metal fatigue on the clip-ons. If you then went and put 5 or 10 or 15 tonnes of load on to help fix it, it might not survive that experience because they cantilever it off the main structure. So cantilevers only have so much load. What's the factor of safety on the cantilevers? Those sorts of questions before you go and do stuff.
Well,
Yes, sorry.
Do most councils in New Zealand tend to self-insure for their assets? Do they have insurance?
They have insurance, but some don't. So most have insurance, but it's never enough. Here in New Zealand, there's the government underwrites 60%, and the councils have to underwrite 40%. But what we found out, particularly in Christchurch and Kaikoura with the earthquakes, wasn't enough. So then you look at what's happened in Hawke's Bay and Gisborne. It's like $10 billion or something. Not enough insurance. New Zealand's relatively well insured, but never enough. Two reasons for that. One is when you're fixing, all the valuations are worked out on a business as usual. I'm doing it in an optimal manner, and I'm doing a little bit each year. You get a really big natural event, you've got heaps that you have to do very quickly. So the price goes up, you've got to mobilise. So the cost is often multiples higher than the business as usual cost. And that figure is almost never the figure that you're insuring on. So there's that figure plus the damage happens in interesting places that you may not have been able to predict. So
Have you been to Hawke's Bay recently?
I have an office in Hawke's Bay, so yes. I've been up there since the flooding. So
In the Esk Valley?
I decided not to be a disaster tourist, but I've seen the photos. So
I had to go down there, so I had no other choice but to go through that area. Didn't do it as a matter of tourism, I did it as a
yeah,
matter of...
whereas I would have, so I decided not to do that. So yeah.
But the bloody place is a moonscape,
Yeah.
There's no railway tracks into it now for joint. It's just complete.
Yeah, it's a fairly major flood. We're just doing questions here, Dr. Henning. So
I think we need to wrap up.
okay.